So Ippei called me. I was sitting in my car at the Trader Joe's parking lot.
This is Diane Bass, a criminal defense attorney in Southern California.
And I answered the phone. He said, "This is Ippei Mitsuhara. And Matt gave me your number. I would like you to represent me."
Diane is the lawyer for the bookie, Matt Boyer. She says this call from Ippei came as a complete surprise. Ippei had been fired by the Dodgers in South Korea, and his plane had just landed in the United States.
The very first words out of my mouth, I didn't think, I just blurted, "You came back?" This is, my defense lawyer hat.
Shohei's lawyers had said Shohei was a victim of theft, and they were turning the matter over to the authorities. Diane says it was clear to her that Ippei didn't understand the gravity of the situation.
Because I knew he was going to be indicted and he'd been out of the country. So why would he come back? And he said, "Oh, I shouldn't have." I felt so terrible for him. And I said, "Well, no, your family is here. You did the right thing."
As a criminal defense attorney, Diane knew that what had just happened to Ippei was going to fundamentally change his life.
And I said, "I'm so sorry you lost your best friend." And he said, "Well, it's my fault." And he basically owned it. And then I just quickly said, "Look, I really wish I could represent you, but I can't." I had a conflict of interest because Matt had given the government information about him.
You hang up the phone with him. What are you thinking? What are you feeling?
I felt really badly for him. He sounded so sweet. I knew he was in a world of trouble.
Ippei was in a world of trouble, and it began as soon as he stepped off the plane at LAX. I'm ESPN investigative reporter Tisha Thompson. From 30 for 30 podcasts, this is The Betrayal of Shohei Ohtani, Episode 5, The Feds.
Federal investigation. Quest about wire transfers. $4.5 million to a Southern California bookmaker. And he has no idea of it.
This episode is presented by Gusto. When you run a small business, you don't just do the job. You're also the hiring manager, the payroll department, and the benefits team, usually all before lunch. Gusto is online payroll and benefits software built for small businesses. It's all-in-one, remote-friendly, and incredibly easy to use, so you can pay, hire, onboard, and support your team from anywhere. Try Gusto today at gusto.com/30for30 and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's 3 months of free payroll at gusto.com/30for30. One more time, gusto.com/30for30.
When Ippei's plane from Seoul landed at LAX, there was a surprise waiting for him.
Legal lesson for all your listeners. Every international airport is considered a border. And at a border, restrictions on search and seizure do not apply. So the federal government have full license to conduct warrantless searches at the border.
This is Martin Estrada. At the time, he was U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California, and it was up to him to decide if there was enough evidence to bring charges in the Shohei Ippei case.
And so we needed to investigate, A, was Mr. Ohtani involved in this illegal conduct? And B, if he wasn't, how did this happen and who was responsible?
They needed to get to the bottom of what really happened between Shohei, Ippei, and Matt Boyer's illegal sports book. They needed Ippei's phone.
Often phones are quite a get. You'll be surprised at what people have in their phones. It's a treasure trove of information for investigators.
We had agents waiting, and we knew that he was coming in. And so as a result, they do what they do, and they ended up having a conversation.
This is Chris Seymour. He was an IRS special agent in L.A. for more than 2 decades when agents intercepted Ippei at the airport.
They take his phone.
Voluntarily.
He gives up his phone.
Voluntarily.
Seymour had already been investigating Matt Boyer for years. He was the lead agent at the raid on Matt's house, and now it fell to him to investigate the alleged theft of Shohei Ohtani's money. Even though he admits in the beginning, he didn't even know who the guy was.
Shohei who? I drove downtown Los Angeles. They have a big image of Shohei on one of the buildings. It's huge. It's massive. And I was like, who's that? I'm that guy who had no idea who he was.
But after getting hold of Ippei's phone at the airport, it was Seymour and his team who read through nearly 40,000 texts between Ippei and Shohei.
There was a ton of information to process. So we had to break it into chunks. This person handles this, that person handles that. My focus was going through X amount of text messages and looking for anything that would indicate who was doing what.
And it was all in Japanese?
Yes, we had to use Google Translate to try to break through some of it.
What were the text messages about?
Just commonplace things. Get something to eat. Hey, we're going to do this. Or what time's this? Maybe a video game. But it was very mundane. Vanilla, I guess, is a common word I would use.
Are we talking like a couple hundred texts a day, a couple thousand texts a day?
A lot. It was prolific, is what I would say.
Was it employee-employer, or was it two buddies? I mean, Ippei said they were as close as brothers.
It was friends chatting.
A lot of friends chat about betting.
Didn't see it.
Not one indication that someone was betting on something.
Didn't see it.
Seymour says they never found any texts between Ippei and Shohei about gambling or sports betting. But Ippei did talk a lot about betting with Matt Boyer. When Ippei was still in South Korea, I had asked during our interview if I could see the messages between him and Matt. But Ippei told me,
I deleted every text I had with Matt.
Seymour found 2 years' worth of encrypted messages on Ippei's phone. And he already had everything they'd found on Matt's phone, which he had seized during the raid, like betting records and money transfers. By combining the two together, Seymour was able to create a timeline of what happened. When Ippei first starts betting, the conversation is pretty mundane.
I've just been messing around with soccer.
This is a voice actor reading Ippei's messages.
There are games on 24/7, LOL. I took UCLA, but they lost outright.
Seymour zeroed in on messages about logistics, like Ippei asking Matt how he wants him to pay off his debts and how to make a wire transfer.
I apologize for the delay. I've never done a wire transfer.
By January 2022, about 3 months after Ippei started betting with Matt's sportsbook, Ippei asks if Matt would reload his account because Ippei says he's lost it all. Boyer agrees and bumps him $50,000. 13 days later, Ippei messages again.
Fuck, I lost it all, LOL.
So Ippei asks for another $50,000.
That will be my last one for a while if I lose it.
But the encrypted messages show that instead of quitting, Ippei keeps betting. And Matt keeps extending him credit.
Any way you can bump me a little bit, I need to wait a week to send another big wire.
This pattern continues for months. Ippei says he needs just a little bit more, says this will be the last time. Matt gives him credit. Ippei loses and just keeps losing.
I'm terrible at the sport betting thing, huh? LOL. Any chance you can bump me again? As you know, you don't have to worry about me not paying.
Matt told me that by this point in his relationship with Ippei, he had seen the wires and thought Shohei was paying for the bets. So he was willing to let Ippei get deep into debt.
I swear on my mom this will be the last ask before I pay it off once I get back to the States. Sorry for keep on asking.
Matt writes back, no problem. Done, bud. Merry Christmas. Ippei's messages to Matt are so casual, so relaxed. When you read them, there's no hint at how high the stakes had become for both of these men. Because by May of 2023, Ippei owed Matt at least $2 million and was still asking for more credit bumps into June.
I got my ass kicked again, LOL.
Matt writes back a long message telling Ippei that he'll bump him, but adds, "It's just imperative that the $500 is sent every week." He means the $500,000 wires. Ippei responds,
"I'm the worst, LOL. Can't catch a break. Can I get one last bump? I swear this is going to be my last until I get the balance down significantly."
Matt gives him the bump. The next day, Ippei sends another ask.
"I have a problem, LOL. Can I get one last bump? This one is for real. Last one for real."
Matt writes, "Done. I have the same problem. To be honest with you, Ippei, as long as you can guarantee the $500 every Monday, I'll give you as much as you want because I know you're good for it." In my interview with Matt, he said he felt like he understood Ippei's psychology, that he could relate to struggling with a gambling addiction. And here Matt is in the messages, essentially telling Ippei that he gets it because he has the same problem. Ippei ultimately bet with Matt's sportsbook for about 2 years. Martin Estrada, the former U.S. attorney on the case, says in that time, Ippei did an extraordinary amount of gambling.
I myself was shocked to see Mitsuhara had bet on over 19,000 sports events over a few years. I mean, even if I wanted to, I couldn't do that many bets.
Reading the encrypted messages, some might see Matt as a predatory bookie preying on someone's weakness, and Ippei as someone descending further and further into gambling addiction. But the federal investigators see it very differently.
I'm not convinced he was just a gambling addict and had no choice. I think it's more he got this great opportunity, but then he saw a bigger opportunity to enrich himself and took advantage of that opportunity.
Because he says investigators quickly realized Ippei wasn't just using Shohei's money for sports betting.
What did the baseball card say to you?
That's a question. That's a real question.
Anytime you get these jerseys on the field together, the blue against the black and the orange, it's special.
Yeah, it's special.
On April 2nd, 2024, the Dodgers were in the middle of a 3-game series against the San Francisco Giants. The scandal had erupted less than 2 weeks earlier.
OHTANI swings and misses at 98.
The Dodgers would go on to win all 3 games. Shohei went 3 for 11 with a home run, a double, and 2 RBIs. What we didn't know is before those games, Shohei had spent the day in interviews with federal investigators.
Before I'm going to go on the record and say anyone is a victim, I want to make real sure that they are, in fact, a victim.
Martin Estrada and his prosecutors needed to assess what Shohei may or may not have known.
Mr. OHTANI was cooperative with the federal investigation from day one. That's not often the case. Even with people who have nothing to hide, people are worried about dealing with the feds.
Investigators spent much of their time going through Shohei's finances, trying to understand the complex network of bank accounts and people managing Shohei's wealth.
Shohei had bookkeepers, he had accountants, he had sports agents, and he had Ippei, and a tax specialist as well.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Mitchell was the lead attorney investigating Ippei. He says the money from Shohei's endorsement deals and other investments in the U.S. was managed by a financial team led by Shohei's sports agent, Nez Balelo.
He had that team in place the entire time. So he never, according to the people who we spoke to, he never, was involved in checking the accounts on a day-to-day basis.
Shohei didn't meet with his financial team very often, but when he did, he would bring Ippei because no one on the financial team spoke Japanese.
And it kind of makes sense. The bank records are in English. He doesn't speak or read English, so he has a team for that.
Shohei told the feds he generally didn't ask too many specific questions.
And when we asked him about checking on the status of your accounts, he would ask Ippei to ask the agents, to ask his team, what is my overall financial picture? And then they would relay that to Ippei, who would then convey that to Shohei.
Ippei having knowledge about Shohei's finances is very different from the typical interpreter-player relationship.
Money was something that we never touched, we never saw.
Kota Ishijima, a former MLB interpreter, says she's never heard of any interpreter other than Ippei becoming involved in a player's financial affairs. And Mitch Lively, the other baseball player that Ippei interpreted for, says Ippei wasn't part of his banking.
In my relationship with him, he didn't access to any of my money.
But Ippei wasn't just an interpreter for Shohei. The Angels paid him to be an interpreter, but he also worked directly for Shohei himself as his personal assistant, according to the feds. When Shohei arrived in the United States in 2018, Ippei helped him set up a Bank of America account. According to the feds, Shohei's salary from the Angels went into this account. Shohei was the only signatory, meaning no one but Shohei could legally withdraw money from it.
And the money was not touched for several years.
Shohei told the feds he thought the money in that Bank of America account was being managed by his sports agent, Nez. Nez is a big deal at CAA, Creative Artists Agency, the biggest and most valuable agency in the world. Nez told the federal investigators that he asked Ippei about this account, but Ippei told him it was private, and Shohei didn't want anyone to have access to it. So Shohei's sports agent was told there was a private bank account with millions of dollars in it that Shohei didn't want anyone to know about. What did Nez think was going on with that account? Why would Shohei need it to be private? Nez Bolello declined our request for an interview. But according to the feds, he never asked Shohei himself about the account and never hired a second Japanese speaker to double-check what Ippei was telling him, even though he was managing tens of millions of dollars for baseball's biggest star. Instead, Nez Bolello told investigators he had no reason not to believe Ippei. But the feds didn't just take one guy's word for it. They hauled in Shohei's financial advisor, his tax accountant, and his bookkeeper. Two of them told investigators they asked the agent about the private account, and Nez Bolello told them the same thing. Shohei wants to keep that account private. He just took Ippei's word for it. What is your understanding, based on your conversations, of how much the agent understood?
So the financial bookkeepers and financial advisors and the accountants were asking the sports agent for the account that ended in the 5848 number. And then the sports agent would ask Ippei for it, and then Ippei would lie and say, Shohei doesn't want you to look at that.
The last four digits of the private bank account appear in court documents, 5848. That's the same bank account number I wrote down in my notebook when I saw the wire transfers. It's the same Bank of America account that sent money to Matt Boyer's operation. And now the feds had uncovered a damning detail. The bank account had been dormant since its creation and was accessed for the first time on the same day that Matt's operation told Ippei he needed to start paying off his betting losses. The feds spotted a $40,000 payment from the private bank account sent a month later and matched it to money received by Matt's operation. They could also see the big $500,000 wire transfer starting in May of 2023.
Although you see the name Shohei Ohtani as the sender, you know that's just a bank account. You know that's just a place where it originated from.
These big transfers from Shohei's account started just as Shohei's salary with the Angels went way up, from $5.5 million to $30 million. The account was suddenly even more flush with cash. And soon after, new charges began to appear. They began in January 2024 and continued until we broke the story about 2 months later. The charges were from eBay and another online marketplace called Whatnot, and the purchases were being sent to someone named Jay Min at the Dodgers clubhouse. But when the feds interviewed a Dodgers employee who handles the mail, the employee told them Jay Min wasn't a real person. Ippei had told the employee that he was going to be receiving packages under that name. When Seymour opened them, along with boxes and briefcases he seized from Ippei's car, he found they all contained baseball cards.
What did the baseball cards say to you?
That's a question. That's a real question. There's a lot of cards, and there was a lot of some high dollar ones in there. It was as if he had some other plan and that this was an escape strategy, or this was his way of converting his loss, the gambling loss and everything and the funds, into something that could be worth something in the future, almost like an investment.
The charges for the cards totaled $325,000.
I think my favorite one would be Yogi Berra. So it's like, this is cool. This is an old Yogi Berra card. This is actually really cool.
A Yogi Berra card can be worth nearly $200,000. Seymour also remembers seeing other highly collectible cards, like a Juan Soto, which can fetch more than $300,000. But the value of a baseball card depends on a number of factors, including its condition and how rare it is.
I could tell that some of these were very high quality. They're high graded.
They had the plastic case around them and...
Yeah, but they were also specially typed cards with the cork and with the pieces of the fabric of the jerseys. So these were not just your dime store cards.
When I spoke to Ippei's high school friend, he told me Ippei had been an avid baseball card collector as a teenager. He would study the cards, memorizing facts and statistics about different players. And his friend remembered how Ippei would try to sell the baseball cards for a profit.
I found one of Ippei's best friends from middle school, and Ippei loved to go to the baseball card conventions and buy baseball cards of his favorite players.
That makes sense.
And he had Shohei Ohtani cards.
Oh, lots of them. Yeah.
What did that say to you?
I speculated that maybe he was trying to get Shohei to sign them for him at one point. I don't know. My gut is telling me that that's what he was trying to do with those.
Was there a smoking gun in Ippei's case where you're like, there it is?
The recording of him calling in to do the wires.
You can't just send a big wire payment out of a bank account without the bank asking a lot of questions. Since Shohei was the only signatory on the account, he was the only person who could authorize payments from it.
This call may be monitored and recorded.
This is a Bank of America recording from February 2022.
Who am I speaking with?
Shohei Ohtani.
Thank you. How may I help you?
So I tried to log into online banking, and it tells me that it's not available to me at this time, and I need a call.
Seymour would track the Bank of America call to the same cell phone number I called when I interviewed Ippei.
Could you tell me the name of the payee and the amount of the transaction, please?
It's for $200,000.
What is your relationship to the payee?
He's my friend.
Okay. Have you met your friend in person?
Yeah, many times.
Will there be any future wires to your friend?
Possibly.
What is the reason for this transaction?
For a car loan.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars for a car loan? The bank employee doesn't buy it and freezes Shohei's account. But Ippei doesn't give up. He calls back and gets a different bank employee. Like before, Ippei says his name is Shohei Ohtani, but this time the bank wants him to answer security questions, things only Shohei should know. But because Ippei helped Shohei set up the account, because Ippei's job is to pretty much know everything about Shohei, and because by now Ippei had linked his cell phone and his personal email to Shohei's bank account, Ippei is able to provide answers that convince the bank employee to reopen the account.
What I found to be the most persuasive was when I heard Ippei in those bank recorded phone calls.
This is Jeff Mitchell, the assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case. The feds found that Ippei impersonated Shohei on the bank calls 24 times.
He's trying to kind of authorize money and wire transfers out of Shohei's account. And you could hear Ippei in his own voice in perfect English say, "Hi, I am Shohei Ohtani." And you know it's not Shohei. So once we obtained those, I think that was like the last piece of evidence that we waited for.
Shohei Ohtani could have said, Ippei, just pretend to be me. Just get it done. I authorize you to do this. I don't want to deal with it. You just deal with it. Did you have to go through sort of that mental exercise of, did he have permission to do this? Even though technically he shouldn't have said he was Shohei Ohtani. He is Shohei Ohtani's personal assistant, representative. He does all his banking. He does his driver's license. He does all these things.
We had so much evidence at that point. So by the time we actually had the recorded phone call, it wasn't really like that mental leap to kind of say, okay, now we have enough to prove our case.
Mitchell points to the larger body of evidence that the feds gathered, and one particular encrypted message that, to the feds, was as good as an admission of guilt.
He confessed. Boyer at one point said, well, it's not like you stole the money, right? And then Ippei replied, actually, no, I really did steal the money.
Mitchell was paraphrasing, but the exact words Ippei used in the message are important. Here is the actual exchange. It happened right after our story broke. Ippei wrote Matt,
"Have you seen the reports?"
Matt responded, "Yes, but that's all bullshit. Obviously you didn't steal from him. I understand it's a cover job. I totally get it." But Ippei wrote back,
"Technically, I did steal from him."
What does Ippei mean by technically I did steal from him? Is he trying to claim he didn't exactly steal from Shohei? Or is it a confession? Technically, I did steal from him.
Good morning. My name is Martin Estrada. I'm the United States Attorney based here in Los Angeles. We are here to announce today the filing of a federal criminal complaint against Ippei Mizuhara, a person who until recently was...
On April 11th, 2024, just 3 weeks after we broke the story, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Mitchell filed a court document. It contained a 36-page affidavit signed by IRS Special Agent Chris Seymour that laid out the government's case against Ippei Mizuhara. And it was Martin Estrada who announced to the world just how much trouble Ippei was in.
The federal complaint filed just a few minutes ago charges Mizuhara with bank fraud for allegedly stealing more than $16 million from Mr. Ohtani. According to the complaint, Mr. Mizuhara stole this money largely to finance his voracious appetite for illegal sports betting.
The charges meant Ippei was now facing up to 30 years in federal prison.
Mr. Mizuhara is expected to make his appearance in the next coming days, and he'll make his appearance in this district.
All right, thank you very much.
Mizuhara was given this golden opportunity. He basically got the keys to the castle. He got that opportunity, but it wasn't enough.
How do you describe Mizuhara? Who is he really in your mind?
I think he is a fraudster. He's a person who saw a chance to take advantage. He went and befriended Ohtani as soon as he signed his contract, saw an opportunity, seized that opportunity, and took advantage of this guy who's really relying on him as a Sherpa to get through the United States and understand the customs here. Ohtani was a victim, clear victim, not just of the gambling fraud. There were other things Mizuhara was doing too. So he basically treated Ohtani like his personal piggy bank, which in my view, especially with all the opportunity that Mr. Ohtani gave to him, is inexcusable.
The evidence that federal investigators gathered in their case is damning. Impersonating Shohei on the phone to the bank, raiding Shohei's private bank account, using his money to buy baseball cards and to pay off gambling debts. Who would do this to their best friend? People who have spent a lot of time observing and covering Shohei and Ippei have always believed that they were close, inseparable.
If Shohei Ohtani was there, Ippei was there. If Ippei was there, Shohei Ohtani was there. I don't know that I ever saw them apart.
The portrayal was that Mitsuhara and Ohtani are best friends. Longtime best friends, right?
They were beyond friends. There was something there that was like a brotherhood.
Even Ippei told me they were like brothers.
He's best friends. We are like brothers. We're with each other every day.
Yeah.
I spend more time with him than my wife, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, he is like a family to me.
Yeah.
But what if even that isn't true?
How did you develop your relationship with Ippei?
Yeah, we're not friends or anything. We're just business partners.
That's next on The Betrayal of Shohei Ohtani. The Betrayal of Shohei Ohtani is based on reporting by me, Tisha Thompson, with support from Tim Kewen and the ESPN Investigative Unit. Our producer is Carrie Ann Thomas. Our senior producer is Max Green. Our senior editorial producer is Preeti Varathan. Our associate producer is Gus Navarro. Story editing by Audrey Quinn, Elaine Tang, Eric Neal, and Mike Drago. Additional editing by Rebecca Hudson. Our archival producer is Jennifer Wheelock. Our line producer is Catherine Sankey. Production managers are Jason Schwartz and Sheena Williams. Fact-checking by John Master-Berardino with David Sabino. Additional editorial review from Masa Niwa. Voiceover by Genta Nakahara. Original music by Allison Leighton Brown and John Delore. Sound design by John Delore. Chris Buckle is Vice President of ESPN Investigative Enterprise and Digital Journalism. Marcia Cook, Brian Lockhart, Heather Anderson, and Burke Magnus are executive producers for 30 for 30. David Roberts, Mike Foss, and Roxana Scott are executive producers for ESPN.